Today is Christ the King Sunday. It's always the last Sunday of the church year because next week we begin a new church year with the first Sunday of Advent. And so, like with the end of any year, it's important for us to kind of consider what we really do here, what we invest our time in, who we really want to become. This gospel lesson today speaks of kind of the priority of what defines our discipleship, and that is Jesus' kingship. That's where we get today's name. But rather than focusing on the idea of kingship, which we could, and that would be very interesting, I want to kind of peel back the layers, kind of separate the veil here, and get at what I find most interesting about what Jesus says to Pilate. Jesus says something about the idea of truth. Now, we know that Jesus is on trial here, and Pilate is questioning Jesus, trying to figure out what's with him and what does he mean to do in the world. And Pilate says, "Are you a king?" And Jesus responds, "Well, you call me a king, but even more than that, I came into the world to testify to the truth." Testifying to the truth. That's a big claim. Made even bigger for us today because what truth is so very hotly debated. Is truth the same as fact, or is truth something more than fact? Now, in this gospel lesson, truth is represented in two different ways. We've got Pilate representing the kind of intellectual truth that we may be familiar with. And then you've got Jesus representing the kind of revelatory truth that we discover in our relationship with God. Pilate's intellectual truth, that's really based on what can be learned, what can be proven through careful measures and thoughtful unpacking. In other ways, it might be called technical or scientific truth, stuff that can be verified or objective. What Jesus represents, on the other hand, is this kind of revelatory truth, the kind of truth that's revealed or discovered through experience, through prayerful faithfulness and pushing the boundaries and deeply engaging our faith. This kind of objective in the story is meant to hold up for us the way that the world defines truth and the way that God defines truth. We are called, in a sense, in our discipleship. When we choose to follow Jesus and define ourselves as Christian, we're actually called to go beyond just intellectual truth. That does not mean ignoring intellectualism, but that does mean rooting ourselves in good, positive intellectualism, and then knowing that God's calling us into truth that might go well beyond simply the intellectualism of our world. We're called to seek after and witness God's truth. Now, the truth that Jesus calls us into, that kind of sacred truth, that originates with God, not with humanity. That kind of truth is neither relative and it's not provisional. And that kind of truth is an intricate part of God's ongoing revelation in the world. We as Episcopalians believe that God is not fixed and static and still, but that God is active in the world, and because of that activity continues to reveal to us in our faithfulness deeper and deeper truth. Jesus challenges us to look beyond simply what we think we know in the world for something that is much deeper, represented by Jesus himself. Now, this means that as disciples, we should be carrying on this intense dialogue in what we learn of the world and what we can prove as objective out in the world, and also through our faith community, what we learn of the truth, the reality of God. What we do in prayer and learning, in service and in giving, what we do together here in this community is we are actually engaging more deeply in what Jesus calls us into as God's truth. That's why carefully investing in a church community is so important. The church community represents God in the world. We, when we come together, actually bring God's Spirit to being right here, and we can feel and discover and learn what God reveals to us in very powerful ways, not about the individual, but about the community. That's why choosing a church is really important, because if you choose a church that is essentially leaning a little too much into intellectualism in the world, that can be off balance. Or if you choose a church that's leaning too much into some kind of just totally blind faith, disconnected from anything that we can actually know, that's a little too imbalanced. And so finding something that holds those two together creates a healthy discipleship experience. We can, as we invest ourselves in our discipleship, find ourselves, like any kind of human, stuck in ruts as well. We all have habits, and we all have the way in which we like to move around in our life. And what a good church is meant to do is kind of push us with love and with grace into a reality that helps us to expand who we are and who we are becoming year after year after year. Many years ago, I remember seeing that a class of seventh graders in one of our local schools here went down to South Dallas to meet with a nonprofit doing really good work out in the community. This was a well-intended kind of trip, the kind of trip that I think all of us would hope children would go on, to expose people to what was going on in the community, especially to meet the needs of vulnerable people. This was meant to be a great experience. And so afterwards, I wanted to find out what the seventh graders had really learned. And so I got a chance to talk to some of them. And as I was talking with them, I asked, what was it that they learned? And they listed off a few things, but one of the students actually mentioned to me that it was the first time that he had ever been to South Dallas. And as a seventh grader, we're talking like 13 or older, I was a little surprised that at that age, someone would have not gone to an entire region of our city. But when I kind of pressed on that idea, many of the other students who had also gone on the trip said, yeah, that's the first time I had ever been to that area. And so later I talked to some of the parents and I said, why would this be the first time that these students would have gone essentially south of downtown? And I think in a moment of weakness, one of the parents actually said, well, I wouldn't take my kids down there. It's not safe. And that experience stuck with me because I think that most of us in this room realize that that's a very small way of seeing the world. It's a quite limited way of constructing the world around us. Of course, we all have our daily routines. We all have our experiences and our habits, yes. But I think it's so easy to get stuck. It's so easy to yoke ourselves to that kind of predictability and that certainty and that perceived safety that we actually limit what we know of the truth. You see, it's healthy to get out there and to push our boundaries. It's healthy to meet people who are living lives differently than us. It's helpful to see that there are ways to be in the world that are good, that may not look like how we choose to live life in a good way. Put another way, our discipleship calls us to actually love God and love our neighbor. If we don't know who our neighbor is or anything about our neighbor, how in the world can we love them? Getting out of our comfort zone and getting out of our predictability, that might even be called getting out of our bubble. It helps us learn more about who we are and who God is. It helps us learn more about the incredible breadth and gift of God's creation. It helps us to see just how amazing God's world really is, and it gives us a much stronger sense of self and ability to actually go out into the world and do good, to go out in the world and to love. If we maintain our small perspectives, then we're actually just going to create radical boundaries around what God hopes us to be in our faith. But if we expand, then we begin to understand God's truth. We begin to get a revelation of who God really is and who we can then be in that truth. As we end a year, and we look to begin a new year next Sunday, it's a really good opportunity for us to imagine who we have been and who we wish to become. It's a really good opportunity, especially given that we are in a holiday season, for us to open ourselves up to the invitation and the opportunity to actually use our gifts in some very effective ways to spread ourselves and to open our boundaries and to crack ourselves open and to not allow our habits and our routines to limit us, but instead to accept God's spirit of strength and courage to push us to do things perhaps we've never done, or perhaps we haven't done in a long time. When we do that, when we allow God to push on us and to move us into new ways and to walk down new paths, do not be surprised when God reveals some kind of amazing truth to you. Amen.